Good evening, I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to the first in our spring lecture series. It's a special pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sheldon Krimsky, here to discuss corporate science and genetically modified foods. Dr. Krimsky is the Lenore Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at Tufts University and Adjunct Professor at Tufts School of Medicine. He's also Chairman of the Board for the Council of Responsible Genetics.
So, I'm going to tell you some stories. What's happening today? Since about 1996, genetically modified corn, which represents about 90% of everything on our market, sugar beets, 95%, soybeans, 93%, cotton, 90%, alfalfa, 30%, rapeseed, which is canola oil, 93%, and papaya, much smaller amount, have been grown and consumed in the United States with the approval of the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So the question is there any reason to doubt these agencies? They are important agencies in protecting our health and our well-being. Is there any reason to question the health effects of these products that permeate our food supply? That's the question that I bring to you today. The Europeans apparently think there is a danger. This is just one photograph of the many things that are going on in Europe. They're much more skeptical. Science is the same in Europe and the United States. It doesn't differ. Science is international. So why should there be a difference in the perspective of the Europeans and the Americans? A number of scientists have maintained that there is absolutely no scientific controversy, that this is only about public perception, Luddites, and ideology. You hear this over and over again. Regrettably, most of the individuals who say this have not immersed themselves into the scientific literature, or they've just have other influences that are affecting what they say. Now, I've been following these issues for over 20 years, so I don't come to this, lightly. The first book that I wrote on what's happening in biotechnology was written in 1991, when the agricultural biotechnology industry was just getting started. And in the book, I raised a lot of questions, because I didn't know what was going to happen decades later. This particular cover has a plant that has tomatoes on the top and potatoes on the bottom, and that was actually one of the designs of the early biotechnology industry, that they could compact vegetables into one plant and help improve productivity. That never occurred. This new book was written in 2014 in order to demonstrate that there remains a controversy over the human health effects of genetically modified organisms. It's something that it's hard to really accept, because we have so much of it, and it's been used for 10, 15 years in our food supply. So how could that be? So I have three pillars of skepticism. The three pillars that hold up my skepticism about the safety of these products. And I'll share those with you, and then I'll go through with you some of the stories that I have been able to learn about in pursuing this subject. The first pillar, the first idea that nurtures my skepticism, is that the representation of the science of plant genetics to the public by elite scientists or those representing corporate interests is disingenuous and often false. It's a kind of opportunistic falsification of the way nature works. And I'm just going to give you a few examples because the literature is very rich and very deep. They say that genetic engineering of plants is precise. That's false. It's inherently safe. That's false. As safe or safer than traditional methods of breeding. There's plenty of data that show that that's false. Highly predictable. Not true. The plant genome is not a Lego system where you just plug in something and you get it to do something else that you want. It's more like an ecosystem. You put something in it and it could affect all the other elements in the system. It would be easier if it were a Lego system, but that's not the way it operates. Second pillar of skepticism. GMOs in the United States are essentially unregulated, exempt from traditional FDA regulations. It's hard to believe. You've got foreign proteins being put into plants outside of their species from bacteria. You can put in genes from fish into vegetables, from other animals into vegetables. You can mix it all up. You would think that somebody would ask the question, is this going to be safe? Well, the FDA was under political influence around 1988, 1989. The influence of agribusiness was very severe. And they didn't want any regulations. They wanted to develop this industry in the United States and for it to go over the world without really any regulations per se. And it's hard to believe because, you know, we regulate drugs, we regulate pesticides, we regulate chemicals, so to speak, although not well. But this was a new technology with new processes, and the decision was we weren't going to regulate it. Now, some of you may remember this figure. Dan Quayle was probably one of the least intelligent vice presidents we have ever had in this country. He had trouble spelling tomatoes, some of you may remember. He was in charge of creating a non-regulatory climate for biotechnology. And this Time magazine cover, no joke, this man may be our next president. This was a joke. It was spread around as a serious joke. FDA gave industry control over assessing the risks. And the best it could do after years of protest was to say, we're going to have pre-market notification. So when a company wants to produce a product, put it on the marketplace, they're going to tell us that they're doing it. Foreign genes added to food, no matter how far from the species that it originates from, was not considered a food additive. FDA has a concept they call generally regarded as safe, GRAS. And it was introduced in 1958 in one of the major overhauls of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But to be generally regarded as safe without testing, you have to meet certain requirements. It had to be generally regarded as safe by the scientific community. There had to be evidence that it was generally regarded as safe. It couldn't just be hypothetical evidence. Somebody sued the FDA, and they were able to get discovery documents. Whenever you have a lawsuit, you can request documents from the agency, or if you're suing a corporation, from the corporation. One of the reasons we know so much about tobacco is that we sued the tobacco industry, and we got room full of documents, and the documents were very revealing. They showed how the tobacco industry tried to create evidence that there was no harm from tobacco smoke. Oh, they were very clever. They set up independent nonprofit organizations, funded them with scientists, and produced peer-reviewed papers that said there was no health risks from tobacco. So, the FDA in the early 90s came under what I would view as political control. These documents that were received in the lawsuit showed that their internal scientists at FDA who said, wait a minute, you can't just claim that this is grass, generally regarded as safe. You have to test these things. There's all kinds of factors that go into when you take a gene from an external system and put it into a lettuce plant or tomato plant or some other plant or a soybean. Many things can happen. You can't just assume that they're safe. Well, these scientists at FDA were disregarded. But the documents are there. They're historically available. So one can look at the documents in 1992 of the scientists inside FDA and what they were saying. How agribusiness got control. This is one example of how it works. I wish it didn't work this way, but this is how it works. This is from a book of the attorney who sued FDA. He lost the suit, by the way, but he got a lot of interesting documents. Michael Taylor, who after serving for 5 years as an FDA attorney, became a private practice lawyer representing Monsanto, then returned to the FDA as Deputy Commissioner for Policy to oversee the policy on genetically engineered foods. And after giving Monsanto what it wanted, joined the company as Vice President for Public Policy. Then in 2009, he again returned to the FDA, this time as Senior Advisor on Food Safety, or what was called the Food Czar. And in 2010, he was made Deputy Commissioner for Foods. Consistently opposed any regulations on genetically modified foods, no matter what the science was showing. This is the book that was produced by Stephen Drucker, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, which tells the full story of how FDA fell prey to industry. And as far as I can tell, and I'm a very careful reader, and I read the footnotes more than I read the text. Because if the footnotes are not good, I don't believe the text. It's sort of like a law review article. You can always be assured that the footnotes are correct. You can't be assured that what's in the text is correct because it's overseen by law students, but that's a secret fact. The third pillar. I told you 2 reasons for my skepticism. The third is that the response of elites and those connected to the commercial development of GMOs to experiments pointing to hazards were ignored and are still ignored. Scientists who produce such data in respected journals, peer-reviewed or refereed journals, were vilified, mistreated, or ignored as irrelevant. These 3 things are very disconcerting and feeds my skepticism that things don't look right. So I'm going to start by showing you all the testimonials that say we have nothing to worry about. And this is a pretty nice list of elites, I have to tell you. Most people read one or two of these names and they'd say, I'm a believer. So first I'm going to make you a believer. And then I'm going to see whether or not I can shake your skepticism, shake your belief, and give you some skepticism. And I'll leave it up to you. So let's start with the testimonials. Richard Roberts, Nobel laureate in physiology or medicine, wrote in our Boston Globe, hundreds of studies and tests have been done on GMO safety, and we have seen no scientific evidence that GMOs are inherently more dangerous than crops produced by traditional plant breeding. He was careful. He used the word inherently more dangerous. He didn't say they were safe, he just said they aren't inherently more dangerous. The trick is that there is no test to determine whether anything is inherently more dangerous than something else. And in science, you make a claim, usually there's some evidence or there's a test for the evidence. No one has come up with a test to determine whether something is inherently more dangerous. It's just not done. Okay, well, but he's a prominent person. Peter Lockman of the British Academy of Medical Sciences. It's as prestigious as our National Academy. Very prestigious. Wrote, there is no experimental evidence nor any plausible mechanism by which the process of genetic modification can make plants hazardous to human beings. He called an end to the controversy in 1999 before it even began. He said, there isn't a plausible mechanism. He can't even conceive of any way. That's pretty strong. The Boston Globe's editorial, of course, they're not scientists there, but July 2014, not too long ago, GMO labeling bill lacks a scientific justification. People who want it, there's really no basis in science for such a labeling bill. Of course, it was passed in Vermont, and now grocery manufacturers of America are suing. Monsanto is supporting the suit. We don't know what's going to happen in Vermont, whether the judges will rule in favor of Vermont or in favor of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Director General of the World Health Organization. It's a very powerful organization to deal with very important issues. Available evidence shows that GM foods are not likely to present human health risks, and therefore these foods may be eaten. Well, not likely, not quite as strong as our British elite. Not likely. Okay. Dr. Jacques Diouf, the Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the United Nations. Current scientific research confirms the safety of GM food. Also represents a lot of employees, a lot of countries look toward the Director General of FAO for support, for guidance. Norman Borlaug, often called the father of the Green Revolution, created hybrid rice that really did affect the productivity of rice in the developing world. Told a packed hall of researchers at the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, there is no evidence to indicate that biotechnology is dangerous. After all, Mother Nature has been doing this kind of thing for God knows how long. Mother Nature, huh? So Mother Nature has been putting the genes from insects into soybeans, the genes from insects into corn. How do we know this? We don't. And it's completely a rhetorical comment that's supposed to simply convince people that everything is safe. You notice he's getting an award from President George W. Bush. The Wall Street Journal cited as its series of 10 myths, myth number 6, had a list of 10 myths. Genetically modified food is dangerous, that's a myth. And the Wall Street Journal proclaims farmers have been breeding crop seeds for 10,000 years. That's about right. But the agricultural innovation known as genetic modification makes liberals shudder. I didn't think it was a liberal or conservative affair. I thought it was a human health issue. Not a single documented illness has resulted from the trillions of meals containing genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, that humans have consumed since the mid-1990s. The technology has been declared safe by every regulatory agency, from the Food and Drug Administration to the European Commission. Now, part of this is correct. It has been declared safe. Humans have consumed who knows how many meals of GMOs since the mid-1990s. I don't know if it's trillions of meals, but certainly billions. And we don't have a single documented human illness that's been traced to it. Nor has anybody ever tried to track such an illness, with the exception of one product that came out and was only supposed to be used for animal feed, and it got into the chips and was fed to humans, and a number of people got ill. That's the only documented. And then the company, of course, had to pull back. They got sued for distributing a genetically modified product that was only supposed to be fed to animals. But other than that, they're probably correct in most of these statements. But I should point out to you that for 50 years, the lead industry said, no one is suffering from lead exposure. The asbestos industry said, we don't have a single case of human illness from asbestos. The chemical industry said, PCBs, this is a wonderful molecule. It's great. We use it in so many things in our lives. We don't have a single case. And of course, they didn't have a single case. No evidence of harm is not the same as evidence of no harm. You have to do the experiments if you want to find out if something is safe or not. It would seem from these testimonials that there is no scientific controversy of the safety of GMOs, and that's the end of it. Only irrational fears amongst food ideologues. As a matter of fact, people are clumping together vaccine denial, climate denial, and GMO denial into one basket. Well, they're very separate things. Climate denial, people who disagree with thousands of scientists, international groups that said, we're in the climate change world now, and humans are affecting it. GMO denial, that's not quite the same as climate denial. Okay, so what does a rational scientist do when there's scientific controversy amongst the elites? I've studied controversy all of my career. Practically when I started working at Tufts, I was involved in controversy, in studying the way controversy emerges in science and why it emerges. So in researching the volume on the GMO deception, I decided to do what scientists do to look at the systematic reviews of GMO health effects. Now, systematic reviews are usually chosen by journal editors. They pick a person who's an established scholar in the field, and they ask that person to review the literature. It might take somebody 10 years to do what they're doing in a few months because they understand the science. And I wanted to find out, what were the systematic reviews saying? This is the deep science. These are the scientists who study science. So they can be more highly respected than somebody who just pontificates, maybe because they have a Nobel Prize. But they might have a Nobel Prize in a field that is not genetically modified crops. So I found 8 reviews from 2008 to 2013. I didn't choose them selectively. I just found the 8 reviews that were done in peer-reviewed journals. I left out earlier years because there wasn't much published. Certainly not on animal studies. So these are a list of the 8 reviews that I found in various journals. Some of them were American journals, some of them European journals. Many of the names are European because the Europeans are doing more experiments than the Americans, because the European agencies and their governments are supporting this work. The American government is not supporting research in this area because they already agree that this can't be a problem. So, I'm going to summarize and give you just the little clips of what the reviewers say. Usually, there's a lot of detailed technical information, but at the end of the review, in the conclusion, they sum things up. Reviewer number 1. Scientific data indicate that animals fed by GM crops have been harmed or even died. Whoa. Wow. Why would they say that if there wasn't data? Don't forget, these are people who are looking at studies. They're not doing the studies, they're reviewing what other studies said. Reviewer number 2. Most products have been found nutritionally safe, although the majority of the studies were associated with the industry producers. Well, he didn't have to say that. I think he was telling the reader, maybe we should be a little skeptical of these industry-funded studies. That was kind of like a secret little message that he says, at least as a careful reader of the science journals, that's clearly what I read into it. Reviewer number 3, many GM food have some common toxic effects. What? That's not supposed to be the case. The studies, reviewer number 4, the studies reviewed present evidence to show that GM plants are nutritionally equivalent to their non-GM counterparts and can be safely used in food and feed. Okay. Agrees that it's all safe. Reviewer number 4. Reviewer number 5. Majority of animal feeding experiments do not indicate clinical effects or abnormalities in organs or tissues of exposed animals. There were some adverse effects, but they were difficult to interpret due to shortcomings in the studies. Is another way to read that. The only shortcomings were in the studies with adverse effects? That's peculiar. There's usually shortcomings in every study. And usually the person who writes the study at the end says, here are the limitations of my study. A good scientist will often indicate what the limitations of their study or the shortcomings. Why only the shortcomings of the ones that showed adverse effects? Well, okay, that's his opinion or his assessment. Reviewer number 6. Health effects of GMOs are unknown. Many people prefer to stay away from those foods. Not much is known about long-term effects on human beings. Most of the effects they were looking at were in 90-day studies. I will describe in a little while the first long-term study that was done. And we'll see what happened to the results of that. But here's a reviewer said, we don't know the health effects, really. And he's reviewed all the studies he found, and we still don't know the answers. Reviewer number 7. Most common result has been no effects at the macroscopic level. That means we don't see tumors in organs. However, at the subcellular level, they are clearly affected at the ultramicroscopic level. That means that the cells are abnormal. Some of the tissues were abnormal. No standardized methods for evaluating GM foods. That's unconscionable. How can all these people compare safety and non-safety when they don't even have a standard method for testing them? Monsanto has its methods of testing. Every single one of its tests came out safe. So this reviewer said the necessity of testing GM crops case by case has been established. Every single product has to be tested, person is saying. And in the United States we say no product has to be tested. That's the difference. Reviewer number 8, this is the final one, so you don't get too bored. There were no adverse effects of GM crops for many species of animals in acute or short-term feedings. But serious debate still surrounds long-term and multi-generational feeding studies. That is what's going to happen to the children and grandchildren of the rats fed the GM crops, which are clearly necessary to further investigate this issue. No multi-generational studies were done in any of these studies that they reviewed. Okay, so that's the scientific literature as interpreted by scientists who are leaders in their field and were asked to do review articles. Those are the only review articles I could find. I also found 25 articles in the literature that cited some adverse effects on animal studies. It doesn't mean that humans are affected, but it is a cautionary thing when an animal is affected by the GMOs. Or they had skepticism about the safety. Now, there are many more articles found that said there were no adverse effects. Again, industry has successfully funded many articles that said everything is fine. But what about the 25 studies? What do we do with them? Dismiss them? When it comes to assessing risks of products, foods, or drugs, we can learn much more from the studies that show there are hazards than the ones that do not. They become more important. Here's an example. Imagine 100 test flights with a new commercial jet. 95 without a hitch. 5 have severe problems, structural failure, electrical breakdown, landing gear malfunction. Do we just discard the 5 and claim we have a safe plane? No, that's not the way we operate in air safety. We go to the ends of the earth to find out why those 5 planes fell apart. And that should be true with food safety and with drug safety. It's the experiments that show danger that ought to be elevated to a higher degree of importance. Now I'm going to tell you some stories. 2 of the most prominent animal studies on GMOs. One was published in 1999 and one was published in 2012. When I dug deeply into these stories and investigated what was going on, I felt a certain distress about the ethics of science, which I think in its best days is the best way we can fix our beliefs, is the best way we can decide things with good scientific evidence. But these cases indicate to me that the scientific community has failed to exercise its responsibility, and I'll leave it up to you to see. Arpad Pusztai, born in Hungary, an internationally recognized expert on plants, particularly certain proteins in plants called lectins. Lectins are the proteins that plants protect themselves from insects. When they have these insecticidal proteins, the insects don't like to attack the plants. So in evolutionary terms, those plants with lectins survived better than the ones without the lectins. So they have insecticidal properties. Dr. Pusztai published 300 scientific journal articles, 5 books, including a couple on his favorite topic, plant lectins. These are some of his books. He was a senior investigator at the Rowan Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland, a very respected scientific institute. He was at the top of his career. He had 8 research programs under his tutelage. He had people working for him. He had money from the Scottish Office for Funded Research. He had money from the public. He had commercial funding. In 1995, Pusztai responded to a request from the Scottish Office of Agriculture. They wanted to test GM crops. They didn't believe the US position that they're all safe by virtue of just the fact that they can't be dangerous. They are generally regarded as safe. And there were 28 proposals, 8 were selected, his was chosen. So he went through a rigorous peer review process for his experiment that he proposed. And he linked up with other research institutes and the Department of Biology at the University of Durham. It's very important that he linked up with a university, as you'll see as I go on. He was, of course, employed by the Rowan Institute. Now, Rowan had a profit-sharing agreement with a genetics company which helped develop this transgenic, or this genetically modified potato. If the potato were commercialized, Rowan would get some profits. You know, if they had a good potato that resisted insects, hey, Rowan would make some money, because potatoes were attacked by insects that reduce the productivity. Arpad Pusztai thought the potato would be a good choice to test genetically modification. And he chose genes from the snowdrop, which is a flowering white flower, because it had a lectin. It had an insect-resistant protein that kills or repels insects. And when he fed the lectin directly to the rats, extracted pure amounts of the lectin, fed it to the rats, that was fine. The rats were not made sick. So he figured, okay, let's take this gene and let's put it into the plant. And at the same time, other people were trying to think of putting it into wheat to fight against the grain aphids, the insects that attack wheat. He had no pre-existing bias against GMOs. I kept reading the historical literature. I couldn't find anything about him that said that he had a bias against GMOs. He actually published a paper on genetically modified peas that were fed to rats that showed no adverse effects. So he thought, oh, this could be good. I'm going to have a potato with lectin in it from the plant. And he had his operating hypothesis that he was doing, that scientists do. He was going to compare the GM potatoes with the non-GM potatoes, with and without the lectin. And he was going to give the lectin to the rats as well, without the potatoes. So he had all these possibilities that he was an expert at looking at the gut of the animals. He had expertise in, unfortunately, had to cut up the animals and look at their tissue and see if there were any problems there, any differences in, and he always had his controls. Now, the results of his study. The rats on the GM diet had poor growth, they had immune problems, even though the lectin itself caused no effects on the animals at high concentrations. Something about putting the gene into the plant that disturbed that ecosystem. Huh. He published his paper in the Lancet that reported significant differences between the thickness of the gut of the rats fed genetically modified potatoes compared to those fed the control diet, which is an indication of abnormality. Now, he had his partner, Dr. Ewan, at an academic institution, and he, of course, was at an institute. And they published their paper in the Lancet. Now, I have to give you some idea of how prestigious the Lancet is. It started publishing in 1823. That's about as far back as it gets. Our best journals in the United States don't go back that far. It has what we call in the business an impact factor of 39. That means its impact on the scientific community, how many times its articles are cited. 39. Most good journals, 2 to 4. The New England Journal of Medicine is probably the highest journal impact factor in the United States. It's probably in the low 30s. So it's up there with the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. Okay. 6 reviewers saw the paper and 5 recommended publication. Most of the time, you only get 2 or 3 reviewers. I'm on the advisory board of about 5 or 6 journals. I can tell you, we give it to 3 reviewers, 2 most of the time, a third one when there seems to be differences between the first 2. It's very rare to give it to 6. The editor of this journal knew this was a hot issue, so he was being cautious. With permission from his director, before this thing got published in the Lancet, he was interviewed on a TV show, World in Action, in 1998, after he got the results of the study. And he expressed his concerns about GM foods. And for a day, he was a hero at his institute, because after all, for 2 days, he was giving the institute some visibility. They liked the idea of having their researchers on television. The press then besieged Rowan, the institute. Phone calls came from the Prime Minister's office. Imagine that. Scientific study and the Prime Minister of England calls Rowan. The next morning, Busia was fired. Fired. He was silenced with threats of a lawsuit. His entire team was dismantled. The protocol of further research that he had agreed to do with the external funding was dismantled. Both the Institute, the biotech industry, the UK government together launched a smear campaign to destroy his reputation. All of this is documented, mostly in the British press. The director of Rowan, Philip James, described his data as a total muddle. Disconcerting conclusions. Well, disconcerting conclusions, yes. Nobody, they didn't want to see any negative conclusions about GMOs. And he went ahead and had a panel review his study. Of course, The advice to the panel was find something wrong with the study. Now there were 6 reviewers. One of those reviewers in the Lancet study opposed the paper, 1 out of 6. He broke a 200-year-old rule of not discussing referees' comments. He went to the press and attacked Dr. Puszczai's paper. His name is John Pickett. Last week, I debated him at Tufts University. He was invited to Tufts to talk about his research, and we had a long debate and discussion. I asked him, why did you violate this rule of this prestigious journal and go public with your review? Nobody does that. I don't send my reviews to the newspapers. I send it to the editor-in-chief. And he says, I spoke to somebody who was high up in the Royal Society and asked him about the ethics of doing this. He says, that ethical norm was designed so younger people wouldn't be afraid of their professors. He says, I'm not young anymore. I'm an established scientist. I don't have to be afraid of anybody. So he felt comfortable about violating an ethical principle in the publishing world. Well, the people at the Royal Society, they just worked hand in hand to make life miserable for Arpad Puszczai. And he knew that Tony Blair had intervened. And there were telephone calls to the Institute from Downing Street, from Tony Blair, and from President Bill Clinton. Now, why would Bill Clinton talk to Tony Blair about genetically modified food? Well, the United States was trying to advance a new industry. And the agrobiotech industry was very favorable to the Clintons. It's hardly believable, but all the evidence points in that direction, that there were political influences that destroyed Dr. Puszczai. Stanley Ewan was his partner, and he had tenure at an academic institution. So the Rowan Institute could not own the data. That's why it was published, because he had a partner who was at an academic institution. Thank God for universities and academic freedom. Ewan described the story about the intervention of Tony Blair. He said, that conversation is sealed in my mind. My jaw dropped to the floor. I suddenly saw it all. It was the missing link. The link about why one day Puszczai was a hero and the next day he was a villain. Until then, I couldn't understand how on Monday Arpad had made the most wonderful breakthrough, and on Tuesday it was the most dreadful piece of work and immediately rejected it out of hand. There were other people who confirmed these political interventions. Now, Stanley Ewan, his partner, was by no means just an ordinary low-life scientist. He was very distinguished. Had 105 publications, collaborated with 182 co-authors, and he was cited many, many times by authors. So he was a very respected scientist. Puszczai has never been charged with scientific misconduct. His papers have never been retracted. He has willingly requested to have his work replicated, that is, to have the experiments redone. Nobody has dared do them. Puszczai was quoted as saying, supposedly, in my previous 279 papers, some 40 of them with the same design and methodology, I was scientifically all right. But then suddenly, I had a mental breakdown. So putting all that together, it just strikes me that this is not ordinary science. The science has been captured by interests outside of it. Now I'm just going to tell you one other short story to show you that this is not idiosyncratic. Gilles Eric Seralini, professor at the University of Caen in France, Normandy. He and his team published a study in 2012 on genetically modified maize, where he reported evidence of long-term toxicity. And it was published in a leading US journal, Food and Chemical Toxicology, which is a journal that many people from industry publish in, many academics publish in. It's a well-respected, not quite Lancet, but it's very well-respected. And his conclusion, females develop large mammary tumors almost always more often than before controls. Pituitary was disabled. The sex hormonal balance was modified by Roundup treatments. Roundup is Monsanto's herbicide. And he had a bunch of abnormalities. And he published a paper, and it got published, and it got reviewed by the scientific reviewers and was published. Kidney abnormalities, etc. He listed a wide number of abnormalities. At first, the editors of the journal supported Seralini, and they cited in their journal when they started to get these letters in and phone calls. They said, look, our peer review system is very good. We respect it. In other words, it's like a jury. You don't like the outcome, but the jury system is the best we have. And the peer review system in journals is the jury system. But then the pressure built up. Eventually, after a year went by, the editors retracted the paper without the author's permission. It can happen. There are a number of papers retracted. Most of them are with the author's permission. But the reason for the retraction is historically totally unique, unprecedented. And they were willing to go in their journal and state the reason. Unequivocally, the editor-in-chief said, the editor-in-chief found no evidence of fraud or intentional misrepresentation of data. That would be a reason for retraction. Ultimately, the results presented, while not incorrect, are inconclusive, and therefore do not reach the threshold of publication for food and chemical toxicology. Are inconclusive. Now, when you talk to any good scientist, they would say almost every publication is inconclusive. There's always something more. There's always a limitation. There's always another study you can do. There's never been a retraction based upon that the study was not definitive. Very troubling. Here's the journal. It's an Elsevier journal. Elsevier is a very respected publisher. That's the title of the article. There it is. If you go online, it says retracted. And that means you can't cite it forever. It's ethically incorrect to cite a retracted article. Over 100 scientists pledged an open letter to boycott Elsevier publisher because of this. It is unprecedented. And another unprecedented event, as soon as the article was retracted, another journal said it would publish the paper. Wow, that's never happened before. And there is an international ethics code about when you retract a paper. And the fact that the results are not definitive is not grounds for retraction in that international code. So what do we do with 25 studies that show adverse effects? Why haven't they been replicated? The answer, in my view, is politics and conflicts of interest has so infused the science, public can have no assurance of the safety of GMOs. If we're lucky, everything we're eating now is going to be fine. But who knows? Maybe not. Maybe in the long-term effects. Maybe it'll have some small, long-term nutritional effects, immune effects that you don't see right away. You don't know because we don't test them. This is the last slide. It gives you an idea. This is just a study that was published, well, actually it was published a few years ago. The toxin that they put into the corn comes from a bacteria. It's called CRY, C-R-Y, with a few letters after it. And this toxin kills the insects, but it's infused in the plant. And of course the hope is that the toxin, when we eat the plant or eat the vegetable, whatever it is, we would break it down in our stomachs and, would be metabolized. So this Canadian group did a study, and they found maternal and fetal blood samples. And they found that this toxin in 93% and 80% of the maternal and fetal blood samples, it was not broken down. And they say there may be a high risk of exposure through consumption of contaminated meat, et cetera, et cetera. Now, little pieces like this keep coming out, and yet nobody pays any attention to them. So I'm left with my skepticism. That's about it. Thank you. Yes.
Using the evidence that you've shown us here, because some of the decisions made violate even the internal requirements of these institutions or publications, because I believe institutions, publications, have to follow their own internal requirements. Never mind the law, never mind ethics. Those matter a lot, but this also matters. Cannot lawsuits be brought? Or don't scientists bring lawsuits? Or do you have to prove you're a damaged female before you can stand in the court?
I have heard about lawsuits against journals, mostly lawsuits in preparation for the publication of an article. I know of at least 2 publications where Monsanto threatened a lawsuit of a journal in preparation for publishing something. That's where most of the lawsuits are. I think you have to show that somebody was harmed in a lawsuit. Journals, the courts don't like to interfere with the work of scientific journals. They like to leave it to themselves. And unless you can prove that you were harmed in certain ways, I suppose you can engage in litigation. But we don't see much of it. Yeah.
Is that because it's not nice to do in that profession?
You sue, if you sue a journal like the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal, you can forget ever publishing in that journal. They'll put you on a blacklist. Yeah, it's not seen as proper to sue a journal, even when they make an error, an ethical error. You expose them. You let the scientific community understand what they've done. But legal communities don't like to get involved in that. They stay away from it. So I don't know of many cases where scientists who had something was done to them by the journal, and this is why journals keep the reviews quiet, and they don't want the reviews being publicized, and neither do the courts. It's like self-regulating. It's self-regulating. You have to trust the people who run the journal.
So it's going to take Oliver Stone to make a movie.
Well, he could do a job on
He's
it.
pretty paranoid.
Yeah, he can. There have been many movies, documentaries about GMOs, and the world is really divided almost. You saw that all of those testimonials. You can see where the world is divided up into those two parts. People in the organic movement think it's all terrible stuff, and then these other people think it's all going to be great. We're going to feed the world because of this technology. So right now there are these two divisions. And even the person I debated from England agreed with me that every product should be tested. That was an important realization. We test no products.
They have to show harm and then you test.
Well, that's the point. The history of the American chemical industry is you have to show people who are really sick and it's obvious, and then they respond. I mean, we have chemicals out on the market now that should be eliminated, but EPA doesn't want to eliminate it. You know, maybe some of you have heard about BPA in the plastic containers. And of course, many people, know BPA, they don't want to have anything to do with it. There's over 100 studies that show the adverse effects of BPA. We've eliminated it pretty much for teething rings. The children were just biting into it all day, and they were getting the chemical in their body, a chemical which is a hormone disruptor. So, but the United States has not banned it, other countries have. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we have to see the whites of their eyes, the sense of the risks.
You have another question over here, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right here.
Yes. Yes.
There were a couple of things. The difference between the European approach and the American
Yes.
approach is the precautionary principle. If we have our doubts, if we are skeptical, it's safer not to go in a certain direction than it is to go and move in that direction and then later have to say, oh, we're seeing health effects. So that was one point I wanted to make.
Well, that is a correct point. They do speak well about the precautionary principle, so I agree with you. The Americans have chosen another principle. They call it substantial equivalence. Somebody created it somewhere, and it's not scientific, but they just say that when you put a gene into a new plant, they're substantially equivalent
To the original plant.
to the original plant.
Right.
So,
The second concern I have about GMOs is that they are now engineering them to take larger doses of herbicide or pesticide so that the Roundup ready crop can tolerate much more Roundup than the previous crop without dying, which means it gets a much heavier dose of Roundup than previously, the residues of which are in the plant and may be much more harmful than the
Yeah.
plant itself.
you're absolutely correct.
And then the third
Yeah.
issue I have with it is just on ecological grounds. We're just talking about human health.
Yeah.
But nature loves variation.
Yeah.
And different plants selectively adapt to different environments and thrive in certain environments. So that if you have crops, you want some variation in drought resistance, shade resistance, how much water, so on and so forth. because you can't predict ahead of time what kind of a year you're going to have.
Right.
So you need some plants that are going to thrive in a variety of conditions. And what they're doing is moving to this enormous monoculture globally.
Global monoculture. That's right. What you described is called agroecology, where you look at the local situation and you try to adapt the plant production to the local situation, rather than taking a seed and saying the entire world will use this seed and our herbicide. Now, the international agency that does research on cancer, which comes out of the World Health Organization, just came up with a rating of glyphosate, which is very widely used in the United States. You can use it in your backyard, Roundup.
And people do.
And people do. And they said they raised it from a possible to a probable human carcinogen. So if there are 5 levels, the top one is human carcinogen. The one below that is probable human carcinogen. The United States is below. We don't accept that. So the New York Times reported it. The food editor actually wrote a column called "Are We Guinea Pigs?" And he said, they're making us guinea pigs with this chemical, Roundup. And I immediately drafted a letter to the Times and then looked 4 days or 5 days away. And lo and behold, there was one letter in the New York Times, and it was from Monsanto. My letter got shoved away. And basically the Monsanto letter said, oh, that's junk science. This is an international agency of some, that's not good. You have to look at what the Germans say or what this one says. They found some group that is more favorable toward it. But that's what's going on now. It's a great struggle between different sides, and the science doesn't seem to be driving it. Yes?
What was your debate about with Dr. Pickett?
It was about the appropriate role for GMOs and whether or not we know enough about the health risks, and whether or not the people who I reported in this talk were treated respectfully or were treated for political purposes. And we also had, as part of the team of the debaters, somebody who was advocating for labeling in the Vermont labeling scene. So it went from labeling to some of the historical conditions, and I reported some of the results that I had here. That's sort of what it was like. Yeah?
Day to day in our practical lives. Is there any way to avoid this stuff? Does organic mean it's clean?
Well, for the most part, that's what the USDA says. It's not supposed to have more than less than 1% of GMOs if it's organic. We're hoping that they maintain that label. And by the way, I have to say, Glickman, who is the USDA head under the Clinton administration, tried to pass a resolution that to expand the definition of organic to include irradiated food, GMOs, and food that was grown with the residue of incinerators. And at that time, the internet had just started to get in force, and the force of public opinion was so strong, they had to pull back. And so currently, if it's rated as GMO, it is not supposed to, if it's rated as organic, it's not supposed to have more than maybe 1% of GMO in it. That's the best we can do. Somebody who hasn't had a chance yet? Yeah.
Is the problem the modification genetically, or is the problem the Roundup?
You know, that's a terrific question. And people are finding there's a specific problem with Roundup, with glyphosate, depending upon its formulations. Whenever you see an herbicide or even a drug, there's an active ingredient, and then there are other ingredients. Very often you don't know what the other ingredients are. Sometimes the other ingredients are the problem. You know, I was once researching some of the pesticides they used, synthetic pesticides they used during West Nile virus. I remember in the year 2000, the trucks came down the streets of Cambridge. I don't know about Arlington, but they were spraying pesticides on the main streets of Cambridge. And immediately called together a group, and we met the Commissioner of Public Health. And we asked the commissioner if he knew anything about what these pesticides do. He didn't know anything about pesticides. He just got the word from CDC, spray. If you see one dead bird, spray. So then I began investigating it, and sure enough, I found out that from talking to people in Washington, that the pesticide they used had what they call an adjuvant, an add-on, called piperonal butoxide. Who would have known? And you start to look that up and you realize that is really a dangerous chemical. And that's what they were spraying in. But they tell you, oh, we've got this pesticide, it's permethrin or it's something, you know, synthetic pyrethroid. But they don't tell you it's also laced with this other chemical. What does this other chemical do? It prevents the enzymes that we have and the insects have from breaking down the chemical. In other words, we all have enzymes, detoxifying enzymes, and so do the insects. So you try to get those enzymes blocked so they can't break down the chemical. So very often the active ingredient has other ingredients. So it's an interesting and complicated question. Also, people are realizing that the construct, the GM construct, actually changes what goes on in the plant. That when you put a gene into the plant, it can actually create a different protein than that gene created in its original home. And that could be dangerous. So you have to test it. They even have a name for it in science, a fancy name for it, because they know, everybody knows what the effect is. To say that anything you put into the plant that's a foreign gene is going to be safe is nonsense. You had another question?
Yeah. I had a crewman that's got Agent Orange. Is the dioxin or whatever it is, whatever Agent Orange is derived from, okay, is that also the same source for Roundup?
No, it's when I first studied Roundup in the 1980s, it was considered the safest of all the herbicides. I have to agree. I mean, I checked all around and all the data was, but now they have more studies. No, dioxin has a bunch of chemicals. One of them is an herbicide called 2,4-D. And by the way, because the weeds are resistant now to glyphosate, there's so many resistance because they use so much of it. So even if it were a good thing, use too much of it, you're going to get resistant. It's like putting too many antibiotics in your stomach. Eventually, you're going to get the bacteria are going to be resistant. The toxic bacteria are going to be resistant to it. So the weeds are getting resistant to glyphosate, so the company is saying, well, what are we going to do? So they're starting to use 2,4-D. So they're going to build a plant now with the genes for 2,4-D resistance. So then they're going to use 2,4-D. And I have to tell you, my students read Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book. She discussed 2,4-D in her book in 1962. She already had data about the adverse effects of 2,4-D, 1962. It's still on the market. But so they used that in Agent Orange, but it was a combination chemicals. And of course, the design was to just destroy all the foliage so that troops could see people hiding. Yes?
Is anyone doing any responsible evaluation of the potential of this technology for feeding people who don't live in the United States or don't live in Western Europe and are consistently, historically malnourished, suffer from famines, and live on the edge?
Yeah.
And is there any possibility of this kind of technology alleviating some of that human misery? I'm not arguing,
Yeah.
the ethics of Monsanto and
Yeah.
Clinton and.
Bill Gates believes in it. He believes in it wholeheartedly.
But,
And so does Clinton. I think malnourishment around the world, global malnourishment, is a complicated problem. It's not going to be solved by a technology like this. There's so many more factors, social factors. There's so many factors having to do with people who are escaping war, who don't have a place to plant, who don't have machinery to do their planting. So it's much more complex than simply producing GMOs for them.
Well, I understand the complexity. I have lived for a fairly long period of time with people who were subsistence farmers.
Yeah,
This was during the Green Revolution, and the hope then was the introduction of things that Borlaug and others developed, IR8 and
Yeah.
other, would make a difference. And I did see, at least over time, some real substantial change in the amount of malnutrition amongst the kids where I used to live,
which was where?
Nepal.
Oh, in Nepal. Yeah.
So, and I also understand that there were problems that we didn't foresee in the Green Revolution that came to light,
Yeah.
down the road. And
Yeah.
I don't see this technology as, inherently evil. Perhaps the people using it might be, but the technology itself,
Neither.
might it have some
Yeah.
potential?
Absolutely.
And is there any institute, individual, academic institution, scientific group anywhere that is doing responsible research to see if we could introduce very carefully and
Yeah.
selectively something that most people in this room never experienced, which is starvation?
Right, starvation, right. I think first of all, I'm not ideologically opposed to genetic engineering in agriculture. One of the best ways it can be used is in selection. So you find a crop
Right.
in some area that does very well. You submit that crop to gene sequencing, and you find out exactly what its profile is. And then you know that that's the kind of crop you want that's done so well in that region. So that kind of selection is very important. And probably the most important use of biotechnology since it was developed, that is recombinant DNA and gene splicing, is not in agriculture. It's in the saving of the lives of over 250 people who were incarcerated falsely. And because of genetics, they were found innocent. So I think there's a lot of power in genetics. And there's a lot of power in agricultural genetics. And when you produce a product that could be useful to the third world, that's fine. Just have to test it.
I understand that. My question was, is anybody doing
I'm not
that?
sure. I'm not sure. Not that I know of in the United States. Not that I know of. A lot of the so-called agroecology people, the people who are looking at natural systems and trying to feed it into natural systems, they don't get funded much. So I'm not aware of anyone in the United States that's doing it.
And Dr. Krimsky, thank you.